Evening, Mayor and council members. I'm Ed Button, Fire Chief for the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department, and what we're here to do is I'm here to give testimony in support of the proposed resolution regarding the custodianship of the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department records. And in giving some background in this, we were asking what is the purpose of this. One of the purposes of this is the relationship between the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department and the City of Moscow. One of the issues is that city employees are tasked with managing the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department records, which is there's a variety of things. And the genesis of this whole process or question comes from the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department's recent completing the process with the IRS as a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. I do want to mention that for many, many years, the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department has been registered with the state of Idaho as a nonprofit corporation. So, in reality, this is not really a unique thing that we're doing here. But again, part of the genesis for this process was the volunteers had missed out on some opportunities through some private corporation matching funds during our fundraising drive. We'd had some previous volunteers that had moved on in their careers. Some of them were our former student resident firefighters that had gone on to some very responsible jobs in corporations, and some of their corporations had matching donation programs that if that particular individual wanted to donate to a charity or a nonprofit of their choice, that corporation would match that donation. And through that process, they would ask for the copy of the letter from the IRS that declared the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department as a nonprofit corporation. And it's only just recently that had even come up. And so through the generosity or of those individuals, then we started that process. So again, we have city employees managing a volunteer fire department paperwork, and through the discussions and through other business operations of the department and conversations with the city attorney, it was discovered, or it was decided that we needed to come up with either a letter, or it turned out to be a resolution was perhaps the best way to resolve this. The process really wouldn't change. The city employees would still manage the volunteers, some of the volunteers' records, but we, as a volunteer board of director member, I'm the president of the board of directors. They're a real independent group, and they wanted to pursue this and define it more clearly. And so that's why I'm here today, is supporting this proposed resolution to you today to make a decision whether to pass it or not.
Thank you, Chief.
Questions?
Appreciate that input. I also talked to the city attorney about it, so I'm probably not the only person with questions about the fact that you're both president of the nonprofit board of directors, and you're also an employee of the city of Moscow. And so and in that there are other employees at the city of Moscow who also serve in the volunteer fire department. So just a clarification in terms of records retention for those employees. I understand there's a potential for tracking it in both.
Right.
Both
I think
regards.
in a day-to-day environment, in a situation where somebody's requesting records, you would see no different performance, no different effect. People would make a request, and they would receive their records if appropriate. If they're legally able to have those, like for medical records. It's the HIPAA rules. It have to be your own records, things like that. So,
sure.
But yeah, I think in the end result, you would see no difference.
Right, but I meant if somebody had a records request pertaining, and I don't mean to single you out, but you or one of the other paid employees, they would seek those out through the city of Moscow. I presume they could do that as well. Right, that's what I believe. Right, and I think, and do we? That's clear by this resolution, Mr. City Attorney.
I hope so.
Oh.
Well, that was a short answer.
Is it?
It's up to you to determine whether you think it's clear. I think it's clear.
Okay.
And it was written to try to clarify the potential that somebody would think that certain records that were in fact thought to be records of the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department were those of the city, which actually occurred a few months ago, and that to me was the generation of this resolution. So both entities agree who the custodian is, and therefore the people who want the records would go to the right custodian, and they would make the legal determination about whether they were available.
Okay, I'm still thinking, though, we have a chief of police and a fire marshal, inspectors who are affiliated with the volunteer department who are, in fact, employees of the city, and I wouldn't want citizens to think they needed to go to the volunteer fire department to request those records rather than directly to the city. It was my understanding in speaking with you that we had an opportunity to retain those records within the city as well for those employees who are clearly on the city's payroll. Correct?
I guess I apologize, I don't understand your confusion. Let me explain what I think happens. If a citizen wants public records, they're entitled to them unless there's a specific exemption to those records. Someone has to make that determination. Many times, for example, a citizen will come and ask for records at the police department that they assume are city records, but in some cases, the city has those records physically but are not the custodian legally, because it could be the Latah County or the judge who has record authority relative to the request. So I don't think that there's a way to prohibit somebody or educate every person who's interested in trying to find out who has a record, who the custodian is. What this does is say that if they come to the city and ask for records that are in fact on this list and not city records, we would simply direct them to the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department, and the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department would make the determination about their records. If they come to the city and ask for records that are our records, the city records, the city clerk would just make a decision about giving them the records. So maybe we're talking past one another.
Perhaps. I just wanted to be sure that the 501c3 nonprofit that would be established and would then, if the council approves this resolution, be the legal custodian of records, would not be the one to say yes or no about a citizen who requests input on a paid employee of the city of Moscow who is perhaps involved with the nonprofit volunteer group, but who isn't a paid employee.
Well, they might. It depends. Because we have people, I understand that we have people who are battalion chiefs that receive monies from the city and could be characterized as people who are, for certain purposes, reimbursed by the city, whose records might not be Moscow Volunteer Fire Department records. And the city wouldn't answer for the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department if the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department was the custodian of the records. If they were payroll records, though, we would. So I don't think there's any confusion, but perhaps I'm not answering your question. The way that this is supposed to work is that someone comes and wants records, and the entities can decide who the custodian of those records is. It's completely legal and legitimate for the city of Moscow to say those aren't our records. The confusion might come because they are physically contained within buildings, in some cases, that are owned by the city, even though they're not city records. And so this just clarifies that here's a list that both entities agree the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department would be the custodian for. And that's all this does. It doesn't have anything to do with 501c3. It just has to do with separate entities having their own jurisdiction to make a legal determination regarding the Idaho Open Records Law relative to a records request.
Right. So here, I'll give you a specific example that's a point of my confusion. Say a citizen comes forward and said, I'd like to see the training records for Fire Chief Ed Button. And we say, okay, the volunteer department is the custodian of those records, and that nonprofit board said, no, you can't have those. I would argue that it is the citizen's prerogative for a paid employee who is the chief of the fire department. And I don't think we would say no. I don't think they would say no. But they would have that capacity to do so? Is that by this resolution?
I only represent the city of Moscow, Idaho, so I can't make a decision about what another attorney or another entity would do. But the system is that all records that are public records are available unless there's a specific exemption for those records, and it is the custodian of the record that makes that determination. If it turns out that a citizen came in and asked for records that were city records, the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department would say, oh, those are not our records, those are city records. That would come to the city, and the city would make a determination about whether they got the record or not. And if the Moscow Volunteers, the fire department, said, well, I don't think you should have given the record, I would say that wasn't your decision to make. And that's also the converse being true. The other thing that happens is that on the occasion where somebody would feel that they should have gotten the records and didn't, they have 180 days, 120 days, 6 months, to go to the district court and say, I think we should have gotten those records. I think they're really city records, and we should have gotten those records. And that's the system. So what has happened before is the city, in the last case that I remember, gave out records that the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department felt were Moscow Volunteer Fire Department records and not city records. So it was my suggestion that we clarify that and say, well, you know, these are your records and the rest are our records, and leave it at that. And then that still allows anybody to make the records request, but it just means that the person who is making the decision works for the entity that was the request was made. Have I still missed it? And so if what you want to do is determine that records of the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department are actually city records, then don't pass this resolution.
No, and I'm not suggesting that, but I am saying that there are some employees who are perhaps in a different category. It says Moscow Volunteer Fire Department training records would be included among these, and of course that can involve our paid leadership in the department who are city employees and in fact a department head. So those were my concerns there, just for public access. And so are we obligated at the time of that 182-day opportunity to appeal that rejection of a request for records starts on the day of the rejection, and those people need to be overtly informed of their right to appeal and how to do that?
The law requires that if there are records that are not being given to a requester, that they be informed that there's an appeal process in the local district court and the date, and they all get a rejection letter that includes that, and that is part of the statute. And so, yes, it begins on the date that they were told that they can't have the records. Probably, maybe some of the difficulty here is that there is a very complicated and at times unclear relationship between the Moscow Volunteer Fire Department and the city of Moscow. It's understood by those two groups better than it is by anyone else who tries to determine what it is. This is an attempt to say that even though there are records that are in the building that the city owns, that doesn't necessarily mean that the city is the custodian for those records. If somebody plays a dual role, then both entities would be able to sort that out, and that may be situational depending on what the nature of the records is. And so that's why there's a long list of which records both entities agree are Moscow Volunteer records, and the rest would be, by default, city records. In addition, the state statute says that if it's not easy to determine who the custodian of the records is, then the party that has actual physical custody of those records is considered to be the custodian for purposes of making a decision about the public record availability. So that's the default. So if nobody can figure it out and they're in the city building, I would assert that they're city records and we'd make the decision.
Okay. And I apologize for having this conversation here because I thought we had resolved that the other day when we spoke about it. So you're saying a particular circumstance kind of inspired this, and the chief is indicating it's an opportunity to bring in some donations and whatnot, so.
Yeah, I like I said, the genesis in my world, it started when we did the application to the IRS. When we got to the city attorney's desk, it had manifested itself and some other people requesting records. But we as a board had been talking about it prior to that, hadn't got to the action level as of yet. And so it brought us, in my world, that's how it originally started. And
we've been moving toward this for a long time, but probably this just crystallized the fact that we needed to do it
right.
in a public way so that both entities understood their relative relation to the requester. But I don't think we're being inconsistent. Whatever the genesis of this is, whether it's the way I recall it, because I look at it from the point of view that engaged the city attorney's interest, or that the Moscow Volunteers were incorporating, to me doesn't change what the nature of the resolution is. And to me, my intent was to make it clear that even though there's a record inside a city building, rather than to assert that it is or isn't a Moscow Volunteer Fire Department record for purposes of who gets to make a decision, the public gets to know up front that here's a list of things that we think are Moscow Volunteer Fire Department records that we'd be happy to keep in our physical custody, but that doesn't mean that we're the custodian of the records. Because, again, the default is who's ever got them is the custodian, unless there's something else that says different.
Okay.